Me?
Yes, loud and clear.
All right, great. Yeah, this weather is, the way it is like suddenly it gets dark.
Hello and welcome everyone to whoever's listening to this particular podcast on YouTube, Apple, Google, Spotify, or any other platforms. I am Shah and I invite machine learning professors, engineers, researchers, and entrepreneurs to talk more about their current work, insights, and about their journey and getting started with it. And today we have with us Dr. Milind Tambe, who is a professor of computer science at the Harvard University and director of the Center for Research in Computation and Society. He is also the director of AI for Social Good at Google Research in India. He has been leading and working on projects that are creating an amazing impact, ranging from wildlife conservation, public health, and safety using AI techniques. So, Dr. Tambe, thanks for being here and welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Very glad to be here.
All right. So, to learn more about you and in concrete terms, like what are some of the projects under the hood that you are working for, under the hood of AI for social good, that you are currently working on?
So there are three broad umbrellas of work that I've been engaged in for the past 15, 16 years under this AI for social good. I'll start with conservation. Here we are focused on how do we protect biodiversity. Specifically, we've been looking at wildlife conservation. And for the past 7, 8 years, I've been collaborating with wildlife conservation organizations, World Wildlife Fund, Wildlife Conservation Society, Panthea, and many others, in order to predict where poachers may set traps or snares. Concrete example is work we've done in Uganda and Cambodia, where harnessing past poaching data, we are able to predict where poachers set traps. And for the past several years, we've been able to remove thousands, if not tens of thousands of these traps. So this has led us to collaborate with these organizations worldwide and make our software available worldwide for rangers to download and use that to predict poaching hotspots and generate ranger patrols. We've also looked at public health as the second area of work. So concrete example there is work we've done with youth experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles. Harnessing the social networks of these youth, we're able to show that our social network algorithms are far more effective in spreading HIV information and reducing HIV risk behaviors compared to traditional approaches. And so we are also now looking at other topics related to tuberculosis prevention, maternal and child care. Now, in the past, we've also worked on public safety and security, where we've contributed new models and algorithms that have been used by the TSA, by the US Coast Guard, by other agencies. The focus there has been more counterterrorism and other threats which are well resourced. So those are basically the three areas of our work. And hopefully that gives you some instances of how our work has been applied.
Yeah, definitely. I have been reading a lot of your work, and you work at the intersection of a lot of the AI techniques plus many social sectors. So, my next question would be like, do you feel there is a major disconnect between when we see these social sectors operating versus how AI is being used in general? So, do you feel that disconnect is still present? And if so, if that is a major disconnect, who do you think should be much more taking the lead into solving these gaps and making this gap much more small?
I mean, there are AI researchers who are very keenly interested in social work, in social impact. I fondly remember visiting IIT Patna a couple years ago, before COVID, of course, and just having all these, talking to all these students who were, it seemed like 50 students, PhD students, all kind of working in AI and machine learning, keenly interested in social impact, but not understanding how to get going. And so the question was, how do we get started in AI for social impact? On the other hand, there are nonprofits often sitting on lots of data, and there is no way that they can figure out who to talk to, who's the right person with the right expertise for their particular kind of problem. And so, we have on these sites, at least in the university, sort of set up students, professors, the other researchers very interested in AI for social impact, NGOs looking for exactly this expertise. And so we need some way to actually do matchmaking and try and start, lots of AI. I mean, I think there's tremendous potential to have a lot of work going in AI for social impact, but there is a gap. Back to the question that you asked, there is a gap, and somehow we have to fill this gap. And so, at least at Google Research India, we've been taking some steps to try to address these problems. I can get into it more if that's of interest, but there's a lot of opportunity also because there is this gap.
Right. And from a computer science perspective, because you have been trained as a person who has been deep interest into research. So while you're working on these kind of applications which have a strict motive for solving a particular issue, do you feel these kind of applications also have some kind of inspiration to be taken into these solving problems? For example, do you, if you hit a problem that cannot be solved within the standard norms or paradigms of computer science or also the AI definitions, do you have you ever had the opportunity to work on something totally from the bottom up approach, saying I don't find any algorithms who can solve these issues, but let me work on something that is solely motivated by the application? Do you see these kind of opportunities over there?
Yes, yes, definitely. That's a wonderful question. So, in fact, AI innovation and social impact seem to go hand in hand. So it's not the case that we are focusing on social impact implies that we are giving up on AI innovation. In fact, it demands AI innovation, and often because these are domains where there is a very limited amount of data and there's a lot of uncertainty. And so a lot of the struggle ends up being, how do you deal with situations where there is no data? I'll give you a concrete example. There's tremendous amount of work in computer science over the past 2 decades on what is called influence maximization in social networks. So you take a social network as input, and then you have to choose key influencers, people who are, who will spread your message. For viral marketing and so forth, this is very useful. But generally, the assumption is that the social network is given to you. Makes sense when there is a lot of data. But in the kinds of domains of social impact that we're interested in, often working with marginalized communities, youth experiencing homelessness or others, there is no social network available. They're not working on Facebook, etc., etc. So we have to do the same work as influence maximization without the social network data. And so therein lies an interesting research problem. How will you handle social influence maximization when there is no social network given? So that becomes like a very interesting research problem to solve. And then in many instances, we find a similar situation where you're given a problem, you try to look for a standard off-the-shelf solution, and it makes lots of assumptions that there's plenty of data, that the environment is very stable, and in reality, very limited data, the environment itself is very unstable, and that leads to lots of new challenges. So yeah, there's just a lot of opportunity to do exciting research when we get into AI for social impact.
Right, right. And also, one of the key things that I realized when I was looking at the project portfolios that you have is the key differences between what we see in standard research community. We have a very strict goal, right? Like we are either trying to improve the performance or we are beating the state of art. But hardly, I think when I'm looking at these projects, I believe you have much more diverse set of metrics. It is not solely the application or you want the most efficient algorithm that is out there. How do you typically go about designing those metrics, first of all, and how do you particularly evaluate the impact of a project? Like, can you demystify the idea of like what do we mean by social impact, or the goodness of a project for social good, or in general AI for good?
Those are, again, excellent questions. We are very keen on making sure that we are not just improving algorithms uh, and publishing in AI conferences under the name of AI for social impact. It really has to show social impact on the ground. And by that, we mean being able to do something like a clinical trial or a randomized control trial, where we have 3 arms, let's say, of an experiment, where you say, okay, there's some intervention that you're conducting, some state of the art way of the social organization, the nonprofit was doing work, whatever the way they were doing. And now you've added another way of, and now supposing there's no intervention. So essentially, for example, with youth experiencing homelessness, we have a new algorithm for spreading HIV information in a social network. So that's bucket A. So basically, there'll be a group of youth we will recruit in that bucket. Uh, then there'll be a group of youth who we will treat, who we will intervene on using state of the art, because the existing nonprofits were using something to spread their message before. So we compare our algorithm to their algorithm, and then to a situation where there is no intervention at all, no algorithm being used. And then we say, who got more HIV information? Who changed their HIV risk behaviors, like using condoms, not sharing needles, what have you? And so at the end of the day, we want to show statistically and practically that our results were significant, that the behaviors actually changed. If we are looking at preventing poaching, which is what I also mentioned, we want to look at, okay, before our software got used, what was the rate at which they were finding traps? After our software was used, what was the rate at which they were finding traps? And so there are, these concrete measures have to be shown. Otherwise, yeah, you got a very nice algorithm, but if it didn't really show actual impact on the ground in a way that the nonprofit found useful, or the partner organization found useful, not really social impact. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. And one of the other questions that I want to pick on is, like you said, impact from at least the technical aspect, which definitely makes sense. But from the other aspect, so because you are working at the intersection, first of all, you are taking these AI techniques and working with a lot of interdisciplinary sciences, right? You said public health, public safety. Wildlife, which is definitely a totally different genre for people to work with, and proving them a sense that AI is making an impact. And this begets a very important question, which is the explainability, right? So if that is something a major factor while you are dealing with these people and making them aware that how AI actually can be useful, how and but from the research aspect, we see there is a clear lack of definitions for what do we mean by explainable AI, what are the characteristics of particular explainable AI. And based on your experience working with such set of diverse people, how would you have defined AI, explainable AI? Let's say if you were to define five, or maybe take more if you want, but what would be the subtle characteristics of saying that this model is explainable, and what would be the most important milestones to hit?
So those are, the communities that we work with. There seem to be three different ways of interacting here, or three different steps that are involved in getting the solutions accepted. So there is, first of all, there has to be some notion of trust that gets built between us and the community. Without that, even if we can explain our solution and whatnot, it wouldn't work. So there is that element of trust that gets built up first. Secondly, whatever software we build, the interaction of that software with their people, with their community, has to be very simple. So if we say that, okay, now, there's going to be this 10-step interaction and you have to enter this, then that is not going to work, even if we can make it very explainable. So it has to be very simple to interact with, and it should quickly give results. We shouldn't assume like a high powered, they are often working in low resources. So we can't say, well, you can run our software for 10 hours on a high performing computer, then you can, no, it has to work quickly. So all of these have to be present.
Right.
And then explainability sort of seems to come after all of these things are in place. And so in some sense, we've sometimes been able to get through these steps, and then doesn't have to be the case that the system is highly explainable, but the interaction piece was simple. So they could understand, this is the input we have to give. It's very simple. This is the output we are going to get. This is what was, this is integrated in their normal workflow. And then it's okay. Then you don't have to necessarily make everything very explainable, because you built up that relationship and trust. So that's the way in which I see now. Of course, if you know if they have questions, the software should be able to say, why did it make this choice and not that choice, and things like that. We haven't found that to be a showstopper, in the sense that if all these other steps are there, then people are willing to say, okay, there must be some reason that the software maintains
Right.
this. It's very important, but I'm just saying that this trust, simplicity of interaction, not assuming that this system, the group we are interacting with is a high-powered, high-resourced group. All of these, if we can address first, then the burden on building a very explainable software becomes a little less.
Right, right. So I guess, yeah, the idea of building up transparency for what they are doing and what the system is actually doing, and trying to make those systems much more decoupled, as in it's not just A to B to C and directly to Z, but just explaining each of these steps would definitely lead to a much more reliable systems.
Right, and integrating the software in their normal workflow and respecting the fact that these are domain experts themselves.
Yeah.
So, for example, for rangers who are trying to look for traps, we will not tell them, okay, you have to look under a tree, under this, that. They're experts. You can say, okay, this is the hot spot, this 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer area. That's what we predict. But beyond that, where might poachers hide their traps? That's their area of expertise. I mean, we shouldn't kind of go to that level of detail. And
Right.
so there is a nice kind of human agent or human AI software boundary that we try to respect. And
Right.
that also helps in terms of getting the software adopted and used. Sometimes in an overeager fashion, if we do something where it seems like we're micromanaging, their time, not respecting their expertise, then there's always a pushback saying that then they don't want that software.
Yeah, yeah. Talking more about the pushback. So, a similar question on the same premise is, there is always a concern. We, like me as a student, I see hearing, like mostly through media articles. I don't know if that is a valid concern or not, but always people are concerned about the use of AI into some other domains, right? So a lot of pushback comes from saying that these things are automating our jobs, or maybe they are much more concerned about the idea of taking away their jobs, which, even though I know that is not real, but how do you go about actually making them aware, saying that AI can be used for good? It is not, definitely, like you said, these people are poachers and these are experts. There is no way AI is going to beat them. But how do you explain that there is a middle way, right? Like AI can be used for good and it is for your benefit or something like that. Let me rephrase the question as saying, where is the balance point? Where do you see the balance?
It's a very delicate balancing point, and often it starts with building up that relationship with the particular community. It's a very when we are doing AI for social impact, we're often working with communities that are marginalized, with communities that are disadvantaged, and the nonprofits who are working with them. We want to make sure that they do see us as humble, coming there with humility, respecting their domain of expertise, and not just, okay, we are going to sit in our ivory towers, think of a solution, and here we are going to, come in and helicopter it to you, and helicopter in that solution to you, and you're just going to use it. But that's not the way it is. It's very much ground up. It's a partnership with their organization, and whatever, I mean, we are trying to build things to what they want to. And in some cases people will say, look, a conservation organization had mentioned to me, maybe I shouldn't mention which one, that look, we don't need AI, we just need better shoes at this point, as to where, given the place we are in. And that's okay. I mean, if they don't need us, we don't want to force ourselves into it. I think this spirit of partnership, of AI researchers and domain experts has helped in terms of building up that trust. And in this way, we are trying to understand their problems from the ground up, and then trying to solve their problems as opposed to suggesting that we know better. And I think that has helped us. I mean, this is not to say you know that there are no friction points. There's always some kind of discussion and so on. But that has helped us in terms of not running headlong into just people feeling that we don't respect them, that we just want to automate everything and over automate everything when we don't even know what it is that is needed and so on.
Right. Yeah, that's a very important point, and which is one thing I resonate very well, because 1 year into my PhD, I've been lucky enough to work with a lot of hospitals. So we are working with this Mayo clinics, and I understand the idea. Like, if I'm going to use my expertise or build a research expertise, I might as well do it for something good. But let me ask you a student-friendly question, because I see a lot of my friends who are working on, like you must have known, AI has a lot of man-made problems, right? We would create our own problems and then try to make an algorithm for, I don't know, the application might not even be there by the end I graduate. So how should and how would students get involved into these kind of projects? Do you, what bits they could do? Because of course you are working with Google, which has a great amount of impact and a reach, but how does someone who is new into the research field simultaneously work on something that has an impact, that has an endpoint, and also build his or her own expertise?
So I'll give you, this is something I've thought about, and I'll give you answers which multiple pathways in order to connect with AI for social impact. The simplest way, perhaps, one that I have adopted in my research group is we just call up nonprofits in our local area or even internationally, it doesn't matter. So we'll just say, hey, nonprofit in Boston area, is there anything we can do for you? And maybe some people will say they don't need us, but there may be some who actually are sitting on data and find AI expertise to be useful. And we've held meetings where we'll call in multiple nonprofits to our university, have a workshop. Uh, the nonprofits will pitch their problems. Our students will listen and say, I can work on that problem. And this has led to some projects. So this is certainly happening.
Mm,
Another is, sometimes there'll be professors in other departments, School of Public Health, for example, or School of Social Work. And, you find friends there and they're working on interesting problems. And again, there can be collaborations there. I found in my classroom, I basically invited nonprofits to come and give lectures. They'll come and pitch problems and say, hey, this is the problem we're working on, and class projects that will ultimately lead to bigger projects. So that's another avenue. In addition, as I said, at Google Research India, we have a call. It's been happening now. It's happened twice every year. We'll put out a call where, like, if you are a researcher, you can apply. If it's a nonprofit, you can apply. And then we engage in matchmaking to launch AI for social good projects. And so
mm,
that might be another avenue. And there we also fund the researchers and the nonprofit to work together. So if it's a young researcher, they're a young researcher, they might want to look at this. So there are all these ways in which, if you are keen on AI for social impact, that it is possible. And sometimes people, if none of these avenues work, I've talked to some students saying, you know, your family circle, your friends circle, there'll be someone, who knows, like, okay, there's a nonprofit thing that they're working on, and they would love to use your expertise for, using AI for social good and maybe initially it starts small. It's not the world's biggest AI research problem to start with. But once the trust starts to develop and both sides understand each other, there can be new ideas that come in that have not been thought of before. And the
right.
project goes in like very, very interesting and new directions.
Yeah, I really like the idea of where you started the point. Like, you have lab meetings where you would invite these real world problems or people who are working on real world problems to bring into the lab and then ask, can AI do that? Which is something I really, really find interesting. And luckily I have found few professors who do that, and I can see the impact, even though I haven't been, like, I'm still on my pathway to there, but I can see how that really motivates people to lead that pathway.
No, that's
But
please go ahead.
yeah, yeah. The next question, like, I wanted to ask is, I have invited a lot of people who strictly work in the domain of AI, right? And I ask them questions like, what are the roadblocks that you think are there? But since you are a person with a great amount of expertise and who works on the intersection, I want to learn more about the roadblocks that you find at the intersection. Not necessarily like, I mean, I can
Yeah.
list thousand problems where I can start with small data sets, computations problems, which are specific to AI. But why do you think are the roadblocks for wide adoption for social impacts for AI, which you think could be at the organizational level or even from personal level or from researchers level?
Um, so I guess, I mean, again, this is a good question. The roadblocks, I mean, as you said, if you start from the top, first there has to be a partnership. Uh, you have to find a good partner. I mean, the NGO has to find a good AI partner. The AI people have to find a good NGO partner. So you start from there. Maybe there is not that partnership. Even if they have the right complementarity, personalities don't match, relationships don't get developed. Sometimes the AI researchers I find can be impatient. I'm sure the NGO side has a similar issue, but I'll find someone who will say, well, I met with the nonprofit and they didn't give me a problem. It's with expectation that the nonprofit would come in and start writing down like a mathematical equation, sum over I, xi, you want to optimize that. When they're not going to come in like that. They don't know, I mean, they don't know what AI is capable of, and they have to understand that. So it takes some time to figure out, what problem can be solved, and they'll kind of develop a problem, and it. So sometimes there's not enough patience, so projects get lost there. But assuming all of that succeeds, then there's a question of whether there is, like you said, data on the nonprofit side to support the problem at hand. Once that is done, then the next question becomes, uh, can they, so you might develop a solution in the lab, can they actually pilot it out? Because you have to have the ability to, because they may say, well, we can't quite deploy your solution, we don't have permissions or what have you. So then it just remains in the lab. It never actually transitions because you didn't get the right permissions, maybe governments are involved, whatever. And then once a small pilot gets done, then of course you want to actually deploy it. And then again, questions come in whether, so there are these multiple failure points. So you have to scout out ahead of time whether there is a good partner, whether they have the data, whether they can pilot the solution, whether they can actually deploy the solution. Our friends, there's a AI institute in Mumbai, in India, in Mumbai, called Vadvani AI. And
Yes.
they have this, I find 7 questions that, and I'm borrowing 4 from them. I mean, but there's 3 more. But basically, they have these 7 questions that you should ask before you start a project in AI for social good, which I find to be a useful list. And so those are essentially kind of the failure points. The one question that we ask in addition is whether there are AI research, because as researchers, we want to know, is there a AI research opportunity in the mix? And because if there isn't, then of course, if you're going to be able to use very standard tools and techniques and solve the problem, then it works. I should mention for your student and researchers, for publication of this work, there are now very nice venues that are coming out. So AI for social impact is a special track at AAAI every year.
Yes. Yes.
And so I assume this track is going to continue, it's going to grow bigger. And so people can submit papers to that track. And the evaluation criteria for that track is different from a standard AI track. So it's
Oh.
not going to be evaluated. So going back to the question of what are the failure points, it's in this track, they're not going to evaluate it based on standard AI metrics, standard AAA metrics, or standard metrics for AI papers. It's evaluated more also on whether there was social impact. And so there are different metrics that are used. And so hopefully people would find that useful.
Wow, that's really good to know because I always critique CS community within having a very stringent hand for criticism for papers. If you are not performing well, if the numbers are not good, the papers have a very high rejection ratio. That's really good to know that they are kind of tweaking those things. Um, but yeah, since we have just a couple of minutes more, I'll just ask this question, which I initially wanted to start with, and which is much more of an overall question just about you is what really motivates you to work on these kind of social problems? Because, like you said, most of the projects don't make it out of the lab, or they have a very high thrust point. Like you have to push too much hard to even get started with those kind of collaborations. So, what is your personal motivation for working AI for social good? Why not work on some projects that could build that could help you build some nice theoretical framework or an architecture for overall computer science problem. Why work on AI for social good?
And obviously there are people who work on pure theoretical AI problems, if you will, and more power to them. And the people who do pure computer science theory, awesome, fantastic, do that. I guess it's more of a personal choice rather than saying necessarily this is the best path or the only path. But I found that to be a more satisfying path. And there is this book called Pasteur's Quadrant. Basically, there are scientists like Bohr who in the past have done very fundamental work, but not directly with the idea of making something directly useful. There's Edison, who's looking for application, but not necessarily deep research. And there's Pasteur, who's basically Louis Pasteur, pasteurization, and so forth, who is trying to solve societal problems, but simultaneously contributing to fundamental scientific work. And so this is a kind of work where we are trying to look at scientific problems, but as they arise in service of some social good. And so this is a area where I find the most satisfaction personally. And I certainly hope that a lot of people will get engaged in that, with the full recognition that we also need just people who do very fundamental basic work. And all these paths are separate and all are good. But it's I've tried my hand at just doing kind of basic work, and I did well, I feel, on that front as well. But when I switched over to going out in the field, to visiting national parks and seeing wildlife, and then rangers collecting these snares, and these are just such cruel implements to maim and kill this wildlife. And they say, well, because of your software, we are able to remove all of these. Or we go to the homeless shelters, or where they say, well, your software has really helped us improve public health. I mean, these are things that just give me deep satisfaction. And so that's basically, something that fuels me. And I really love sort of doing the work in the lab and then going in the field and seeing that, I can really see the impact right there.
Yeah.
So that's what keeps me motivated.
Yeah, definitely. That's really motivating, and I hope people who are listening to this podcast really finds this to be motivating for themselves. And yeah, I mean, I have been reading a lot of your work since the past, I think, 1 year or so. So you're doing amazing job. So keep up with that. But with that time crunch, I think I'm done. These are the only questions I had, but I'd like to thank you for fitting this into your schedule, and I hope people find this useful. And I'll leave a link to your homepage so that if they have any kind of cool ideas, or if they want to collaborate with you, they will definitely reach out to you via your email. So thanks once again for being here and sharing these amazing works with us. Thank you.
Hey, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for all the great work you're doing. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.